Hey everyone, welcome to today's video where we're going to be looking at First Death in Nova Scotia by Elizabeth Bishop. Just a little bit of background on this. In terms of her biography, you'll remember that her father died at a very young age. Her mother was committed to a mental institution when she was 6. She never saw her after that. Okay, she lived in Nova Scotia in Canada for a time, and here she recounts one of her first experiences with death, and that is of a younger cousin, Arthur. Okay, so as with all these revision videos, we're just going to go through it. We're going to highlight the poetic devices and just give you a short summary on the poem. You'll have done it in class already, so this is more about just revising the poem and having a good understanding of it in terms of answering questions for essays or mock exams or indeed the Leaving Cert. So, in the cold parlour, my mother laid out Arthur. Okay, look at the repetition of cold here. In the cold parlour. Okay, so the repetition of cold, highlighting how cold it is, not just in terms of the physical cold, the atmosphere of cold. My mother laid out Arthur beneath the chromographs. Now, chromographs here are simply photos. And in this case, they're photos of Edward, Prince of Wales, with Prince Alexandra and King George and Queen Mary. Now, it should be noted that all of these were dead at the time. Okay, so all of these dead. There's a sense here that everything in the room is dead. There's a sense of immortality among the photographs as well, though, because they live on through these photographs that people have in their homes. Below them on a table stood a stuffed loon, okay, a stuffed bird, okay, that her uncle had shot and stuffed. Shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. Now look at the repetition of S's here. Stood a stuffed loon, shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. So we've sibilance there. Repetition of S's, that soft sound. Okay, a kind of a quiet sound within the poem. Stood a stuffed loon, shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. Okay, so in the parlour, she's looking at all the things in the parlour except the body of her cousin. So she's looking at the photo. She's taking comfort in what else is around, and I suppose it's a kind of a coping mechanism she's using to take her eyes off the dead body within the room. Okay, just go to page 2. Since Uncle Arthur fired a bullet into him, he hadn't said a word. Now, this shows the innocence of the child there. The lack of understanding of death. So the loon, it's stuffed, but she just thinks it hasn't spoke. Okay, he kept his own counsel. So he kept his own counsel on his white frozen lake, the marble top table. So she compares his marble top table to a white frozen lake. Okay, so there's a bit of a metaphor there. His breast was deep and white, cold and caressable. The alliteration there, the repetition of the C's. Okay. His eyes were red glass, much to be desired. Now, there's a sense here that she's, the reason he's desirable here is she would rather look at the stuffed loon than look at Arthur. Okay, so it's again a coping mechanism, trying to take away the sadness or having to come to terms with her cousin's death. Okay, so the one to remember here is the innocence of her as a child. So since Uncle Arthur fired a bullet at him, he hadn't said a word. He kept his own counsel. Okay. Moving on to page 3. Come, said my mother. Come and say goodbye to your little cousin Arthur. Now, it's important here. This is the only poem where her mother is mentioned, and it's a poem about death. Okay, so that's important in terms of a biography. We also see a bit of dialogue here. Come and say goodbye to your little cousin. Now, I was lifted up. Okay, shows how small she was. Okay, so how small she was here. She was lifted up, and think of the imagery here, and given one lily of the valley to put in Arthur's hand. Okay, think of the imagery there. Okay, so she's been given a flower to put in Arthur's hand. Arthur's coffin was a little frosted cake. Okay, again, metaphor here. His coffin was a little frosted cake. Shows again the innocence of the child and the simplicity of children. So the coffin would have been quite a symbol of innocence itself, but she said it was a little frosted cake, and the red-eyed loon eyed it from his white frozen lake. So it's as if the loon is now, it's a predator eyeing up the frosted cake of the coffin. Again, I suppose it shows the kind of idle thoughts of a child in certain situations. She's talking as a very serious situation, and these are the things that are rumbling around in her mind. Arthur was very small. He was all white, like a doll that hadn't been painted yet. Okay, so a simile there. He was like a doll that hadn't been painted yet. Very clear image, a very clear way of showing how white he was. Okay, Jack Frost had started to paint him the way he always painted the maple leaf forever. He had just begun on his hair, a few red strokes, and then Jack Frost had dropped the brush and left him white forever. So again, the ramblings or the thoughts of a young child. There's a sense of a fairy tale here. Jack Frost was supposed to paint him. It was the belief that Jack Frost was the person who painted the nature white in winter time, but then when autumn came, or when spring came, he was the one who painted the trees green again. And he had just started on Arthur, but he dropped his brush, so he has obviously red hair. He has a few red strokes, and then the brush was dropped. He left him white forever. There's a sense of, it's very final. He's white forever here. Okay, simply for a dropped brush, and that would be again another metaphor. The gracious royal couples were warm in red and ermine. Now, this is great contrast here. It's the first mention of colour that isn't white. Okay, so there's a contrast there. The gracious royal couples were warm in red and ermine. Their feet were well wrapped up in the ladies' ermine trains. They invited Arthur to be the smallest page at court. Now, it may be something that the children are often told. If a child dies, they're often told they've gone to be an angel in heaven, or maybe she was told he was going to be the smallest page at court. A page, as you know, was a young boy training to be a knight. So he was with the royal couples. And I suppose in her childhood innocence, you would believe something like that. But there's a sense that something else is breaking through, and she begins to question it. But how could Arthur go, clutching his tiny lily, with his eyes shut up so tight, and the roads deep in snow? It's a bit like childhood versus this coming of age versus childhood versus knowing. I suppose it's like the fairy tales that we have, and we begin to question. She's starting to question the story of Arthur being the smallest page at court. It's a nice story, but she thinks no, it doesn't make sense. So that's the poem. It's about a young girl, I suppose, her first experience with death, the death of a family member. Things to remember are the imagery. Everything's very white, cold, sterile. Then that's contrasted in the final verse with the warm red of the royal couples. The other thing to mention is there's immortality is mentioned a couple of times. We have the royal couples in the photographs, and you have the stuffed loon, and Arthur's there, and his mortality is shown. Arthur's going to be buried. And I suppose, does she think that Arthur is going to be stuffed as well and kept beside the loon? As a child, these sort of things, you can't take for granted that people know what's going to happen with death. The Jack Frost metaphor, very important to remember. Again, the thoughts of a child and how they interact with death. Okay, so again, it shows Bishop telling a story in a very unique way, and it's a great insight into how someone with their first experience of death, how they came about, how they coped with it. There is coping mechanisms in there that you may recognize. We try everything we can to avoid looking at a dead body. We try everything we can to basically not acknowledge what has happened. So that's it for today's poem. Any questions, remember you can email me, and for more notes, endasEnglishNotes.com. Thank you.